right, Rob, thanks for coming in and having a chat with us today and talking to us about your project around the culturally responsive schooling. Just a few questions to work through with you. Firstly, starting off with, what is a culturally responsive approach to schooling? Why is it really necessary in Australia, and why now?
Okay. The way that I've gotten onto the concept is, and maybe we can answer all three questions in some sort of intermingled way. There's sort of two things that I'm sort of responding to. One is the appalling learning outcomes for Indigenous kids in Australian schooling, and again, if you're trying to have a slightly larger purview, then it's clear that Indigenous kids learning across the Pacific Rim countries is actually in trouble. And so we're talking about Australia, New Zealand, the USA and Canada, and maybe South America, which are the sort of classic settler colonial countries that have very similar colonial histories. And as well, around the same time, the schools that I've been working in, and in some cases I've been working in sort of a particular region of Adelaide for the last 25 years, is manifesting increasing cultural diversity. So there's an increase in cultural diversity in the country. What was the finding recently? Someone had done some sort of maths on it. Almost half the population come from families that come from other parts of the world. So in the last generation. So I've got one school I've been studying that has 75 nationalities. Lots of schools that I work in have 25, 35, 45. So we're now sort of thinking about sort of super diverse classrooms. So you've got and again back to the sort of Indigenous kids. When you go and have a look at the sort of demography of Indigenous populations in Australia, you find that most Indigenous families are living in either our Australian metropolitan cities or large rural regional towns, in which case most Indigenous kids are going to the local public school. So a sort of micro case of that, the project we're running at the moment around cultural responsive pedagogy. The teachers we work with will, typically say that they've got, 2 or 3 Indigenous kids in the class, often from different nations. In some cases, not even Indigenous nations from South Australia. They might be from New South Wales or Western Australia, with 13, 14, 15 other nationalities, which you can sort of map Australia's involvement in its sort of humanitarian refugee program over the last 20 years. So. What do teachers, how do teachers respond to that? That's the sort of provocation. And again, now here we are, 20, 30, 40 years of Indigenous Aboriginal education policy, still shocking outcomes. I think there's a claim being made in Closing the Gap that there's been some improvement in post-compulsory schooling around year 11 and year 12, but that's a scam because of the way that the jurisdictions have been measuring participation in higher years. So in South Australia, you get to generate a percentage on the difference between the students enrolled in October and the ones that are still there in the end of November, and they claim 96%. I kind of think I'm more interested in retention rate from the numbers that turn up in year 8 and who's still there at the end of year 12. Now you'll be hard pressed to find those numbers, but anyway. And then on the sort of, again, if you're reading that, the Indigenous Education Archive across the Pacific Rim countries, particularly in New Zealand and Canada and the US, and in the US, some of this archives in the African American communities, there's very hopeful stories about what's been called culturally responsive pedagogy. Okay, so when my colleagues and I look at where's culturally responsive pedagogy in Australian jurisdictions, we find almost no evidence of the key word being used in a policy sense, and very weakly developed notions of practice. So one of the most hopeful possibilities across the sort of global context is weakly developed in our country. So that's the basic logic for trying to pursue culturally responsive teaching. That's.
I also, in my own work in this space, I heard you talk about this earlier, patterns of distribution in cities like Melbourne and Sydney, where I've been recently working. I suspect Brisbane would be similar, maybe Adelaide, where you have pockets of schools where there's that super diversity, but also pockets of schools that remain very whitewashed. And I think you were talking about it earlier in terms of white flight. So is a culturally responsive approach to schooling primarily to be directed towards schools that have that super diversity, or is there a role and a place for culturally responsive approaches within more whitewashed settings?
Good question. I think if you're arguing for a sort of a strong version of it, then in both contexts. So I think. Clearly, when you're in a school that's got super diversity, then there's just the existential demand. There's no getting away from it because the diversity is walking into class. So that's sort of a lay down was there. But in the sort of more, in sort of white schools, it appears to me as though to be living in multicultural Australia. Can't see how this can work unless Australian citizens are quite competent with the cultural diverse population. So you almost have to be feeling sorry for the poor kids who are in schools that are predominantly white, not being able to have opportunities to develop social relationships and understand the cultural diversity in the Australian population through being in classrooms with the others, so to speak. So. I guess one of the other things that one can bring to the table here around a sort of rationale for cultural diverse teaching is trying to imagine how we could be moving towards a sort of a post-colonial Australian nation, in which case we're needing to sort of reimagine how we understand the nation in a sort of post-colonial sense. And one of the key sites for making a post-colonial nation is through its schools. So all schools need to be working strongly on that front. And again, I think sort of culturally responsive teaching is sort of one way of trying to make the argument about what that might look like.